Good afternoon. Welcome to Marquette Law School, Eckstein Hall. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. As you know, this is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who, as we say, are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. I want to wish everybody a happy St. Patrick's Day. We're glad that you're here and not somewhere else partaking in a libation. It's nice that you would be serious to talk about policy and politics today. We're joined by a couple of Wisconsin's congressmen. On my immediate left is Congressman Mark Pocan. He's from the 2nd District, from the Madison area. He's a Democrat, as you'll find out in a couple of moments. And seated next to Congressman Pocan is Congressman Ribble. He's a Republican from the Fox Valley area, from the 8th District. And we'd like to welcome them to Marquette University Law School. Give them a nice round of applause. Well, these two gentlemen are part of something called the Problem Solvers Group in Washington, and we're going to talk about that this afternoon. But I wanted to begin by asking them to describe their political philosophy, because as you will soon see, they do not agree on certain fundamental things. So we'll spend a couple of minutes on that, and then we'll kind of move forward in our conversation. So Congressman Pocan, tell us a little bit about your political philosophy.
Sure. One thing I think people may know is I have a record from being around previously. Even though I'm new to Congress, I served 14 years in the Wisconsin legislature. I served 3 terms on a Dane County Board of Supervisors. So I've been at local, state, and federal government. I consider myself a progressive Democrat. No, not afraid of that term at all, progressive part. I'm also a small business owner, who has a union printing business, which sometimes, fills a few boxes that don't necessarily always go together, but I think it helps make up a little bit about my political philosophy. I think that government should be there to do what we can to help people have opportunities so their families can succeed. That means helping the middle class as well as those aspiring to be in the middle class. And pretty basic stuff. I do focus a lot on economic issues. I serve on the Budget Committee with Reed, and I used to serve on the Budget Committee here in the Wisconsin legislature. But I think a progressive Democrat who's a small business owner who owns a union shop, which sometimes can create some interesting mixes.
All right, Congressman Ribble.
I've always kind of been careful about putting labels on people or even ideas, because it means something different to everybody who hears it. So I am a Republican. I often call myself a Republican with a small r. I'm very conservative from my perspective. However, I've got a fairly strong libertarian bent, which can move you more toward a liberal side of things depending on the particular topic. And so a little difficult to describe it, but I would describe myself as a conservative.
So on some of the big issues, you probably would agree to disagree. Things like the Affordable Care Act, things like minimum wage, a number of key issues you would probably have pretty strong differences. Is that correct?
I would think, although Mark and I haven't spoken about those two things, actually, we talk quite a bit because we serve on some committees that are the same. And I reached out to Mark as soon as he came. I was in the House of Representatives for 1 term prior to Mark coming. When he won his election, surprisingly, I had 2 prominent Republicans from the state assembly that called me and said, "You need to get to know Mark Pocan. He's a guy that you can work with." And so as soon as Mark arrived, I had already contacted his office, said, let's go out to dinner. My wife and I took Mark out to dinner so we could get to know each other, and we offered to help in any way we could. And I will tell you that mirrored what Tammy Baldwin did for me. When I first came into office, Tammy Baldwin's office reached out to me and said, "Happy to help you any way we can. If there's questions you have about setting up your office, we're happy to be there." There's a fairly collegial relationship between the members of the Wisconsin delegation. There's often Wisconsin-related initiatives that we must work on together, and it's much easier to work on if you start from a position of friendliness and respect. And so that's why we did that.
Well, you also, I would assume, even though you may disagree on some issues, you share concerns about what's happening in Washington and about how the American people view Congress. We've all seen the public approval ratings. We hear about the growing distrust, the growing cynicism. I want to get your perspective on that. Are the American Are the American people right to feel that way about their Congress?
Without question. I think my favorite poll to quote was the one that was done a year ago December, so not this past December, the December prior, right as I was coming into Congress. Instead of the normal, do you like Congress? And 12% of the people say yes because they didn't understand the question. They said, what do you like better, cockroaches or Congress? They chose cockroaches. Head lice or Congress? They chose head lice. Traffic jams or Congress? That should be a wake-up call to anyone who serves in a body where people... We did beat out the Kardashian family and the Ebola virus.
Did they ask news media?
No, I don't think I was...
They'd ask news media. You might have been doing better than they.
So I think it's fair that they're just going there, it's frustrating. I mean, first of all, there is a federal bureaucracy. I never really felt like there was a giant state bureaucracy. There is a pretty big federal bureaucracy to deal with. So already you've got some things that are built up to slow down things, probably slower than they should be. But just, since the last 4 years until this past fall, we haven't had a budget. I mean, just even the littlest things didn't happen. One of the things that I really like about Reed is, this is Reed just wants to get things done. He comes at it from a very pragmatic approach, which is not the, who's going to score the most points for whichever political party, but how can we best just get something done. So one of the things that Reed approached me on was a bill that I was one of your, I think, original 4 folks, and now we got 147 sponsors to change the budget process. So instead of an annual budget process, where for the last several years, annually, we got nothing done, or could you go to a 2-year budget process like you have in the state of Wisconsin and most states, get the budget done in 1 year, and then the next year, use it for review and analysis and make sure that you're actually doing the right things and actually putting the right time into the process. When Reed approached me, I thought it was a perfectly good idea. I served on our budget committee here. We've advanced it together, got a lot of bipartisan support, actually got a bipartisan committee vote. You don't hear about that a lot because in Washington they want you to think, I think we all have shivs and we're waiting for someone to come out the door. And in reality, some of this stuff, is happening. But, that's one of the things that I think Congress has a bad reputation deserved. But I think that there are people more than you'd think who would like to see it different. And, I've just been really very happy that Reed has been someone who's reached out and we've been able to work together on some of these things.
Do you share that belief that reputation is deserved? I mean, you said you come at it as a business person. Yeah. You ran a business for 30 years and elected in 2010. I mean, do you see Congress as being as dysfunctional as the American people believe it to be?
It probably is in some respects, and in other respects it's not. I mean, but if you look at American history as it relates to the Congress of the United States, there were times that they were taking whips and canes to each other. We haven't done that. But I mean, they'd break down right into fist fights and duels in the chamber, and so it's not like that. However, I will say this: that we could change very quickly, I believe, the way the American people view the Congress. And the way we view ourselves, because I think it starts there. It's hard for the American people to respect the institution when the people in the institution don't respect it. And so first thing we need to do is we need to begin to shift the rhetoric away from being disrespectful about the institution itself, and how Mark and I speak about it needs to move up the food chain a little bit and start being more respectful about what we do. It's important work. But then also, in the political dialogue that takes place within this country, we need to elevate that dialogue. We don't need to call each other idiots and all this kind of stuff. Just go to any newspaper article that has anything to do with politics and look at the comments. Go to my Facebook page and look at the comments. Some of the tweets that Mark received today. The dialogue within the United States is negative about politics. It's up to us as leaders to elevate that dialogue, to change the conversation from one of disrespect to respect. And if we're able to do that, and how we treat each other, how I speak to Mark, how Mark speaks to me, and then how we speak to each other as citizens, we can begin to elevate how people view the Congress. And I think that's part of it. So I've had a shifting feeling about it, Mike. I've been trying to change how I speak of it.
So the two of you have joined something called the No Labels Problem Solvers group. This is what, about 90 or 90 plus members of Congress now. Help people in this audience understand what that is. What do you do that is so different and so special?
Well, might have a slightly different approach on this. I think it's what helped bring a lot of us together who wanted to see something happen different in Congress than just the fighting. A lot of leadership folks kind of like that because they control folks a little better when you don't get together in a bipartisan caucus. The goal was to get us together just to get to know each other. So I got a chance to meet Reed. I got a chance to know Richard Hanna, a second-term Republican from New York, another small business owner. We had something in common. Now we're working on legislation together just to socially do that and talk about some issues of the day every week, but also...
Once a week thing?
Yeah, once a week. Some of our attendance is better than others.
Yeah.
But to get to know people and have a chance to find out then what you have in common.
This is just for people in this room. This is not being done in Washington.
This is the first time it was ever...
something new and different that you get together once a week with people from a different party and talk?
Yeah, that's a unique concept in Washington. Now, what I worry about, and that's why I say where I might have a little bit of difference is, recently they've been talking about trying to put us towards an agenda, and I get a little concerned about that because I think the magic of it was come in there without an agenda, get to know people, because it's, if you get to know Reed Ribble, I guarantee it's impossible to dislike Reed Ribble. And then when you find out
what my wife isn't on the same page.
But then you find out what you got in common. We're both small business owners. I know where we disagree on some policy, but the goal, our job should be, and from the years I've been in office, is you can find compromise without compromising your values. You find out what you can work off of at least. But at the end of the day, people expect us to get something done. So I give you a little bit of a long answer to that, but the bottom line is it brings us together in a way to get to know people in an environment that is doing nothing but trying to help us to facilitate that.
Why did you join this group?
Yeah, well, I actually started it. So when I came to D.C. And I went to my first committee meeting, I had the impression that Republicans and Democrats are going to get in a room kind of like this one, and we're going to talk about transportation or the budget or whatever, and we're going to debate it. We're going to try to win each other over. We're going to try to share the argument and persuade. What happened? Republicans were sequestered into their room. Democrats were sequestered into their room. And the only time you would come together is when you were going to mark up a bill, but at that point, it's already antagonistic. The problem is already degraded into politics. And so it seemed odd to me that there was no place within the Congress for members of the opposite party to actually sit down and try to understand each other. And listen, I grew up in a very conservative home. My father's a very conservative person. My mother was a very, 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 very conservative person. And so that was kind of my cultural upbringing. But without regard to that, I needed to learn from folks like Mark, well, don't just tell me what you believe. Tell me why you believe it. Help me understand it, because it's like we're talking a completely different language. But there was no place for this sharing of ideas to actually happen. So I went to Scott Ridgell, who's a friend of mine. He's a Republican from Virginia. And I said, why don't you go find a Democrat? I don't even care which one. Just pick one. And I'll go find one, and let's go have dinner. And so he invited Jim Cooper from Tennessee. I invited Kurt Schrader from Oregon. We went, we had dinner. And we started talking to each other. And then when we were done, we kind of enjoyed the conversation. We said to Kurt and Jim, why don't you go find 2 more Democrats, we'll go find 2 more Republicans, let's do this next month. And then there were 8 of us. Now there's 92 of us. And really can't come, if you want to kind of join our group and come and have these conversations, if you're a Democrat, you've got to bring a Republican with you. If you're a Republican, you want to join the group, you've got to bring a Democrat with you. The idea is to try to maintain a level of parity as far as the numbers so that no one side can dominate the conversation, but that we actually have a conversation. And we wanted to get this started in a way that we could initially just begin to understand each other, because there was no place for us to do that. And so we did that, and we now have some legislation. The biennial budget bill that Mark spoke of is one of those initiatives. In the 112th Congress, we had 38 co-sponsors of that bill. Well, I've got 50 Democrat co-sponsors of the bill this year. And so it's truly a bipartisan effort, and it went through the committee on a vote of 22-10, with 6 Democrats on the committee supporting it. And so I really believe that our founders intended for disagreement to happen, and in essence said to future leaders, where you can find agreement, do those things. But if you can't find agreement, maybe the idea is not good enough to do yet. And so continue to work on it until you can get agreement. And then if you can get agreement, do that. One of the reasons you don't find agreement in Congress is because hardly anybody looks for it. And I just decided that I was going to look for it. And then let's at least do that.
Let me ask this question. Why are there only 92 members of a group that gets together to talk about issues of the day? Why is that? Why only 92?
Well, part of it, from my observation, first I got elected in November of 12. Within 2 weeks, I think it was, we had our first official training. 2 weeks of official congressional training. 81 freshmen, Democrats and Republicans. They bring us to the training, and for 2 weeks they separated us by political party for all but one dinner and one reception. So they taught us bad behavior, not even on day one, before day one. And part of it is leadership, quite honestly, on both sides likes that because that's how they can control the system a little more. So I'd love to hear Reed's perspective, but I think that's, at least as I see it, is...
Same.
Yeah.
It was the same. I mean, there is a power structure there, and you learn to live in it, but like any other power structure, it can be exploited. And so I spend a lot of my time figuring out how to exploit it, quite frankly.
What's the risk? Is there a risk? My guess is there is a risk to say, I'm going to sit down with somebody from the opposing party to talk about issues. Did you take criticism when you began this idea? Did people say, this guy's a rhino, this guy's a Republican in name only, he's not a real conservative? Did you face that?
Sure. Of course I did.
And what's your response when people say that?
When I am approached with that attitude from my conservative colleagues, my response to them is this. What is it about what you believe as a conservative American that you so lack confidence in that you're fearful of having me take those ideas into the arena of debate in this country and present them? And all of a sudden they say, well, that's a pretty good question, Congressman. And because I'm not afraid to have these conversations with Mark. We're going to disagree on issues like how to reform Social Security. We're going to disagree on the Affordable Care Act. And that's okay for us to disagree. Disagreement is okay. We first of all, we have to get to a place where we accept the fact that we're a nation of 300 million people and we're going to have different opinions. Those opinions are good for us. And that diversity is good for us. And instead, we ought to be embracing this. And you can be principled and reasonable all at once.
If I can just add, I think Reed actually takes on more risk than I do. I'm in the minority right now. So he's in the majority taking on the leadership, which they're the ones who put the bills on the floor. So he's bucking where it's a lot more difficult. When you're in the minority, you got less to offer your members to keep them in line. And Reed's bucking it from that sense. Where I usually get it a little more is from some folks in my party who get a little upset, like, well, why are you doing something to help Reed Ribble? It's not that I'm doing something.
You're friends with Speaker Boss in the Assembly.
Yeah, Robin. We got to know each other from being in the Budget Committee.
There probably people said the same thing.
Exactly.
What are you doing hanging around with Robin Boss?
Yeah. But then later, I think, what I'm hoping is they see that we all got things done with that relationship, and that maybe that's a good, successful way to do things, because, you have to have that. I mean, I remember the very last day of session that I was around in 2012. We were up all night, like we used to do in the Assembly, a little too often, and we had one final issue to deal with, and the leadership and Dems and the Republicans weren't talking to each other. They didn't trust each other. And I had Robin and Scott Souter come up to me, and because I had a working relationship with them from the Finance Committee, they said, this is what we're trying to get done, but we can't get it done. They don't trust us because it had to happen in the next session. So I had to go with them to my leadership and say, look, I trust these guys. I've had deals with them before. They haven't backed out. They're telling you they'll do it next session. We can finalize this. And then when I had people who trust me, but you have to build that trust. And I think part of what Reed and I are trying to do is get a whole lot of people to build some trust so that even if we disagree on things, we can still figure out how to get other things done, or even things around the issues that we disagree on. There's still some commonality, and now I'll understand a little more why he comes at his approach, and he'll understand a little more why I come at my approach.
Let me push back on this notion of bipartisan cooperation a bit. Here's the point. Sure, you might be able to get some smaller things done, but at the end of the day, can you really tackle issues like immigration reform or Social Security? Or are we just going to be essentially in a position that we are today, that the sides disagree strongly, and there is no middle ground as far as either of you are concerned?
Are you going to give me that one?
I'll give you that one, yeah.
No, I mean, The reality is that political parties do have differences of opinions on some of these things. You just cited two of them. However, back in 1776, this country and our founding fathers cast off the shackles of a sovereign king and replaced them with a sovereign people. And at the end of the day, the people make the change. And so what they will see is if in fact the tension is too tight, the tension between the two places is too tight, they will release the tension by changing the people that they send to give voice to their opinions. And so what you could see, and what are likely to see in the fall election, I believe this is likely to happen, is that the American people will release some of the tension by giving the Republicans control of the U.S. Senate. The tension will still be in place. The check and balance will still be in place because President Obama will still be there to either veto or accept things. But they'll release the tension through the electoral process. And I think that's likely to happen. The American people are still in control. Often it's difficult to feel like you're still in control because you're one of so many millions. But the fact of the matter is you are collectively in control, and that's a really great system.
Yeah, let me offer a very practical perspective on it. One term of my 3 terms, so 2 of the 6 years I was on the Joint Committee on Finance, we had a split legislature. We had a Democratic Senate, a Republican House, and then the governor was Democrat. But we had to come up with a budget on an 8-8 committee, because it was 8 Republicans, 8 Democrats. Nothing passed without a bipartisan vote. 8-8 is deadlock. So either you took the governor's budget part and parcel, or you had to work out deals to do it. I was put in charge of the corrections budget along with Scott Souter. We were the 2 people. At the time, Scott was probably one of the most conservative members. I was probably one of the most progressive members, and it just looked like, it was going to be a train wreck. But we got a chance to sit down and talk about things. And what I realized is I was, really want to focus on early intervention and prevention. But really, so did Scott in a way. He might have wanted to focus a little more on the punitive side, but I could understand how we could come across. What we figured out was how to craft it. It was one of the few 16-0 votes we got was the entire corrections budget out of having that sort of a conversation from 2 people who look at things in a very different ideological way. Each of us would have done a different budget if it was just our budget, but in the end, I think we advanced things that I cared about that made sense in the early intervention prevention side, some things he cared about around some additional protections on bracelets and things like that. And in the end, though, it was one of the few, again, 16-0 votes. So it's possible to do it on issues, but you got to at least find out what you've got in common and where there are certain lines in the sand, but then you figure out how to work around those.
Your desire for bipartisanship does have boundaries, though. Right. At the end of the year, there was a bipartisan budget passed by Congress. You were the lone person in the Wisconsin delegation to vote against it. And I remember having you on my TV show, and I said, it must be a little lonely. You're the only guy out there saying no, and isn't it important symbolically to vote for a bipartisan budget? But you said no. Why? Help people understand that there are obviously limits. Sure.
And in fact, and then the next vote is a good example, too, of what happened. Because I wound up voting for the appropriations then to make sure the funds got out because government had to run. The problem was the budget itself was still a bad budget. It still was an austerity budget, in my opinion. It still kept half of the sequester in this year. Only 20% of the next year was fixed, and we're still at it in the future. So a lot of the things that I cared about weren't there. So I looked at it and said, no, as the budget itself, that big number that we're going to set everything from, it was a bad way to go. But once we got there, I made sure that we could have government, operate, and I could vote for them, the expenditures within it. So I think you're right. Sometimes it is important to have that vote, because otherwise no one would have questioned what was in the budget. Now I could say, look, we still did this. Oh, you did? You still did this. Oh, you did? Because I still want to fight to get rid of the sequester, because to me, it takes away our ability to actually sit down and do a budget and make the tough decisions. The sequester was the kind of a 5% across-the-board cut that was decided by the previous Congress. They couldn't get together on something. They decided the best thing to do is put such a bad proposal together from both perspectives that it would force us to act, make cats and dogs lie together. And sure enough, when we got to the deadline, it didn't act. And we have for 10 years in place this kind of across-the-board cuts that don't make sense in a number of different ways. So that was part of why I did that vote, so I could talk about that, why we still need to get that done. And yet at the same time, I'll bet you Reed would much rather have us do our budget, I don't want to speak for you, Reed, but do our budget process correctly rather than have something like the sequester that takes it out of our hands.
Of course, there's no doubt about it. I mean, you want to have a budget agreement, and see, we were exactly the opposite. Yeah. I voted for the budget agreement, but voted against the appropriation. And so my logic for voting for the budget agreement is because we needed a budget agreement. We needed to have a top-line number, and it was a biennial budget, which then gave us a level of certainty that would be injected into the economy because all this fiscal fighting would ultimately kind of disappear for 24 months. The reason I voted against the appropriation, because a 1,000-page appropriation bill was handed to me about 60 hours before I had to vote on it. I didn't have an opportunity to study it. We could have done a short-term 3, 4, or 5-day appropriation to bridge it so members of Congress could know what was in that bill. And so I asked leadership to give us more time. They said no. So I let Mark move it through.
And certainty is important to you, because I know one of your more controversial votes, at least with some in your party, was you voted to end the government shutdown last fall. You were worried about the nation defaulting on its debt. Help people in this audience understand why you did that and what the reaction to it was.
Well, depending on who you were. I would say the reaction was about 80% positive, about 20% negative. You know, obviously, very staunch conservatives opposed that. They felt that they could bend the opposition party to their will, even though we didn't have 218 votes in the House, 60 votes in the Senate, and the vote in the White House to do so. But I believe that the American people deserve a functioning government. Now, the interesting thing, a lot of the things that we've asked for during that whole process of during the 2-week shutdown, things we asked from the administration regarding the Affordable Care Act, the president has used executive orders to do those very things. We've been accused of trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act. He's been repealing it all on his own, from my perspective, by delaying this and delaying that and changing this and changing that without the approval of the Congress. And so, but I didn't feel it was the right fight at the right time. And I was public about this going into it. I alerted conservatives in my district early on that I didn't think it was the right strategy to use. And often the arguments are about strategy. I don't know if it's the same in your caucus or not, but often the arguments are not about policy per se, but about strategy. How do you get to the right policy result? And I didn't think that that was the right strategy to use. And so I opposed it and when the opportunity to vote. But I did this, Mike. The night of that vote, I dialed every single home in my district and had about 20,000 people on the phone with me. For 1 hour, I just said, I'm going to give everybody, as many people as we can, a chance to give me your take on this bill. Here's what the bill does. It's going to reopen the government. It's going to make these trade-offs. Go. And I just went 15 seconds and boom, 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 boom. For 1 hour, I just listened to people talk. I just listened to the voices of the citizens that sent me there to be their representative. And it was about 80% to 90% said reopen the government.
How much of what we see in Washington today is the result of the way congressional districts, legislative districts are drawn? There's a lot of talk about that. The Democrats talk about it an awful lot because I think they feel like right now they're not in the position they'd like to be in. But I'd like to get each of you to weigh in on that. How much of that how much of the redistricting question play into what we're seeing in Washington?
A very significant amount, 70, 80%, in my opinion. I think when you have 60 competitive districts out of 435 districts, competitive in a Democratic Republican way, maybe 80 in a really good year. You get up to 80. That's 20% of the districts. But what happens is the phenomena that's in Reed's party right now that's tougher, I think, is because of the Tea Party, they have these primary challenges. We don't have the same in the Democratic side. We don't have a Tea Party organization. So I think it's more difficult on the Republican side. But I've sat next to people with 26-plus Republican districts. 26-plus means the average Republican will win by 26 points. And they'll tell me, I was hoping I don't get a Tea Party opponent. So that's where their election is, right? They're not thinking on the Democratic Republican, let's get something done. They have to go, God, what if I get that? And trust me, nothing is more painful than a primary where you fight among supposed friends, because at least it's among some where you've got more things in common. So that redistricting.
You experienced that, though, did you not, when you ran for Congress?
Yeah.
One of the people who's a state lawmaker ran against you, and I think wasn't thrilled that you were cooperating with Republicans on certain things.
And you know what I'm really proud of? That was her campaign focus was, I think I voted on 2 bills that the governor supported, but so did like 88 people in the legislature. That wasn't the part that was said. But the fact that I have a working relationship with people. I mean, I got a lot done in the legislature, real important things, passing a Compassionate Care for Rape Victims Act with a Republican majority in the Assembly, but because I worked on it and you worked with people from the other party, got things done. But that was her thing was that, look, you can't This isn't what we should be absolute. We have to, demand. And I still get from people, they want me to fight in a different way. I'll fight like hell. I'm a great street fighter when I need to be, but I'm only going to use it when I need to be. There's other times you can get things done in a different way. So her message in the end lost by 50 points. I won that primary 72-22 in a Democratic primary. So I was really proud that primary voters even said, we don't want someone who's just going in absolutist that understands you have to be able to get something done. The problem is, I think in some of these Tea Party districts, it's tough. There are not districts where a Democrat's going to beat the Tea Party person. That's going to have to be a business Republican. I don't know if that's the best term, but it's a term I use. A more business type, more traditional Republican to beat that Tea Party Republican. We had that happen in 2 districts in the South in special elections in Alabama and Louisiana. I never thought I'd be an advocate for business Republicans, but I'm a huge advocate because that's where it's going to happen. They're going to have to do it internally in order to change this, because I know where, in my opinion, it's 30 or 40 people that have held all the rest of us hostage during way too much of this session that I've been here. 30 or 40 hardcore Tea Party people. Speaker Boehner, I think, has made some bad decisions that he'd rather be Speaker than do the right thing, and sometimes he's let them run the show, when I know how many people were just as upset as Reed was during the shutdown, other Republicans that I talked to. And let me just finalize this. I was getting on the elevator in January with a Republican from my building, a nice guy in the building, and we're talking. I'm like, we've been back for 2 weeks and we haven't done anything again. And he goes, oh, don't worry, it'll get better in 3 or 4 years. That's, so to me, I see the problem is that 30 or 40 people with the redistricting that we've done, we've made very few competitive districts where you have to talk about things like we're doing in problem solvers. We're not forcing that. Instead, we're allowing this kind of lopsided conversation that happens with the Tea Party, 30 or 40 people dominating a conversation. That's my opinion, but that's what I see.
I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think redistricting is a big problem. It's not 100% of the problem. I think it's 70 to 80%. It's probably a good number. I've often said it this way. Most Americans, when they go into the voting booth, they believe that they're selecting their representative, without ever really knowing that before they ever got in their voting booth, that representative had already picked them as a voter before they got there. And so it's a threat to democracy. And so we need to have a more open redistricting process. The fact that there are such a small number of competitive districts in the country is a problem, and it's a problem from the left and from the right. If you're in a district that's D plus 25 or R plus 25, the type of person that those districts are likely to send to represent them and give them voice are going to be tacking further to the perimeters of the political spectrum. And as a result of that, finding any type of commonality is difficult. There's about 186 totally safe Democrat seats, nearly 200 totally safe Republican seats out of 435. It creates a problem, and it's been that way because everything's been gerrymandered. You want to see gerrymandering taken to an art form? Just go and Google Illinois congressional districts. I mean, they've taken it down. They've gone to the point where with computer modeling, you can pick a house across the street and put it in a district. And it's astounding what's been done. And so I've been vocal about opposing how redistricting is done. I think there ought to be a bipartisan with independents designing the redistricting maps and trying to get some level of parity so it more accurately represents the voter. I think it's a big problem. But there is a certain amount of self-selection that does take place within population. You do have a tendency to live in neighborhoods and have your kids go to schools whereby you have affinity with people. And so there is some of that happens. I'm in one of the purplest districts in Wisconsin. And so I like serving a purple district because it fits my temperament, my personality, and the tone of discussion and discourse that I would like to see in the national political scene.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but right now you have no opposition in your district. We are in the middle of March, and you do not have you do not have a Democratic opponent yet,
or Republican at this point,
or Republican. You don't have.
I do have a Republican who's running now.
You do.
A few weeks ago announced something ran against Tammy in 2008.
Okay. Same thing. All right. I want to wrap this part of it up, and we'll then take your questions. But you mentioned your service in the state legislature, and I want you to do a little self-analysis here. When you first were in elected office, were you the guy we see today, or were you the guy who was throwing the bombs, who was going to rip it up, who wasn't going to agree, wasn't going to compromise? Which guy were you?
I was a hell of a bomb thrower. I would throw the bomb, and then people would say, "What'd you hit?" I'll go, "I don't know, but it blew up." That was what was fun. And but what I found is my values haven't changed a bit. I said I'm a proud progressive Democrat. But I also realize you got to get something done. And I think the time I spent on the Joint Committee on Finance, where you spent 3 days a week for 4 months sitting next to people, working with people, Robin Voss and I, to this day, I still like to tease him. We're very good friends. He's one of my best friends in the legislature. I know some Democrats find that rather problematic, but he's one of my best friends in the legislature. He's wrong 98% of the time. I tell him that, but we also learned how to actually get things done and work through stuff. And that committee, I wish every legislator in Wisconsin could serve on that committee, because it gives you that perspective. So it's not just the fighting, but it's actually you have to work together and find solutions. The one sad thing that happened in my last term was when the uprising, I still refer to it as the uprising, the changes on Act 10 that happened. After all of that, 6 months of intense feelings in the Capitol, I remember going to a college universities committee, and Steve Nass was the chair. Mm-hmm. There's probably no one in the legislature I have less in common with than Steve Nass. But I come in and I start talking to him, because that's what you do, right? You have that conversation. And I watched all the other Democrats come in, all the other Republicans come to the committee. Not a single person said hello to each other. We had the committee meeting, and no one said goodbye to each other. And, and some of that was just the feelings left over from that, but you can't function as a government like that. I mean, I'm going to try to convince Reed why I would love to extend Social Security by lifting the cap. I know Reed's very concerned about making sure that program is there in the future. I know, so we can try to have a conversation. We may come at it from different ways, but I know where his priorities are. I'd like to share why I think we could do it a little differently. But then at least if you could have that conversation, you can get something done. And I just think the legislature, that helped me quite a bit, because I came in and Scott Jensen and I tangled quite a bit at that time. And yet by the time I got in finance, some of the things I got done were by working actually with Scott Jensen and getting things done.
So you've had a fair amount of political experience. You were a political novice when you took
Still am.
Still are. What's been your reaction to Washington? Is the job fun? Is the job... you said it's important.
Yeah, I think the job is important. I certainly wouldn't put this on my top 10 list of things to do. I think one of the reasons that both parties are having difficulty finding people to run for this office is because the American people have such a contempt for Congress. And somehow we've got to elevate that so that we can have a better political dialogue and debate in this country. I don't find the job particularly appealing or fun. It's a lot of hard work, more than I ever expected. I thought, well, how hard could this be? You go to Washington and you sit in a few committees and you try to persuade people. It can't be that difficult. But the real work that gets done is not so much what happens in Washington, but what happens in Green Bay, Appleton, and Oconto when that veteran calls you and said, I can't get my benefits taken care of. I've been working on this appeal, but it's not going through. I need your help. Or a senior citizen whose Medicare bill didn't get paid or Social Security benefits not showing up. We never really talk about that, and the media never asks me, talk to me about constituent services, talk to me about what happens in the real workday. Those are the things that consume me, because I'll tell you right now, if you had a problem, sir, with your Social Security check, that is the most important thing to you. And we have to recognize that really matters to that individual. If they're taking the time to call a member of Congress about something, and that's where the rubber hits the road. And that, if I'm going to take pride in something about what gets done or what I've been doing, it is more about the pride of the men and women who work in my office and meet the needs of those constituents on every single day. I will take pride.
Here's my final question for each of you. Based on your experiences in government, you're running for your second term in Congress, but you've got more than a decade in the Assembly. Running for your third term in Congress. Would it be good if we had term limits in this country? Would that deal with some of the issues we see today?
I don't necessarily think it would, because a lot of the problems we're having are people that came in really in 2010. It doesn't matter how long they've been around. It's more the attitude they brought in to it. So I've never been convinced. I think you can have a term limit within your district by the election, maybe not on the DR split, but you can still have primaries, and we have had. Last fall, I know a friend of mine who's a freshman, Beto O'Rourke, down in Texas, beat an incumbent Democrat in a primary because they weren't serving the folks anymore. That's what you have the elections for, so you can do that. So I've never thought that automatically you need to replace someone just by the number of years they're in, and I don't think the problem we currently have is necessarily reflective of that.
I'm a firm believer in term limits. I'm self-term limited. I term limited at 4 terms. This will be my 3rd, and if the folks are gracious enough to send me back, I'll make a determination on the 4th, but under no circumstances will I serve in the House of Representatives more than 4 terms. And I do agree with Mark that I could be term limited in this fall's election, so the voters ultimately will have to say. However, there is a sense that I have knowing that every single day that I go to work, and at the end of that day, it's not, that bank account of time is not being replenished at the back. I lose that day, and so I go to work with a sense of urgency about getting something done for the American people that some of my colleagues, and I'm not saying about Mark or anybody else who's not term limited, that they just don't have because they can't feel what that feels like to know that there's an end time to your work. And so I'm urgent in my work. And I'm diligent in my work, and I think that urgency is important. But beyond that, I think General Washington and President Washington set an example of the idea that you serve for a period of time, and then you go back to your home and your community, and you live under the rules that have been promulgated while you were in office. And the idea of a citizen legislator moving up, serving for a period of time, and going back, I think that's a great American ideal. And it's one that I embrace. And so for me, it fits my personality, it fits my family. And so, yeah, I'm a supporter of it.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience. Please raise your hand and press down on the rim, not on the button, but on the rim. We'll start over here. I'll go ahead.
Thank you. Welcome to Marquette. When Ted Kennedy passed away, part of his history was they recorded that he was author of or co-author of something like 6,000 pieces of legislation. So I was struck by that. I imagined all of the career legislators over the decades and how many pieces of legislation, which really are rules and regulations when you come down to it, have been created over time. So my question is, as you look at trying to get things done, is any of that energy, is any of those discussions focused on eliminating any legislation that exists? And I don't mean like buggies aren't allowed to be, horse-drawn on the sidewalk, but you know what I'm asking.
I can tell you from the Republican standpoint, a lot of energy is directed that way. Typical Republicanism would believe in limited government, sunsetting of certain provisions and laws so that they had to be reaffirmed. I think part of the problem with our economy is we're governing as if we're in the 19th century, but we're living in the 21st century economy. And so the idea that certain provisions sunset and have to be reaffirmed in a modern time, I think, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think what can be sometimes misleading is, you see the 6,000 number, but is one of those bills, for example, the bill to get rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. That's getting rid of a policy, right? It's not implementing something new. So I think sometimes a lot of those are just that. I think the real challenge we have is when we don't do a normal budget process, and that's part of why I really like the bill that Reed and I have to try to change it so it's a little more thoughtful. What Congress is doing is passing continuing resolutions for a few months at a time. So what that does is it continues all the practices of the past, smart or not, without putting any idea into what you want to cut or any idea into what you might want to invest more in. So what would happen is for a long period of time, you just kept doing the same old thing. And we have GAO reports that show 35 areas of duplication in federal agencies that we haven't touched because we don't actually do the budget process the way we should. If we had that process, it's a nonpartisan thing to go in there and say, let's get rid of waste and fraud. That makes sense. And we already have a bunch identified. So I think it's more by us not following a more normal process. And so much happens in that budget process. I mean, bills, I always think like in the legislature, 2/3 of what we did in a legislative session happened in a budget bill. So that is all the more reason why I think when Reed and I talk about this, it's because it has so much impact on what we get done. And you should, constantly review what makes sense and what doesn't, not just the buggy stuff, but a whole lot of other things.
Yeah, and just as another aside, in the highway bill that was signed into law last year, about 100 different bureaucracies were consolidated. And so you do have a chance when money's actually appropriated to get at some of those things.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Go ahead.
Can you comment on money and outside money and how money is impacting you when you're running for Congress, et cetera?
How does money impact?
Well, it impacts everything. I mean, everything's about money. I mean, in the campaigns, but also in governance. And so I am not a big advocate of having outside groups running campaigns. And I will tell you that the voice of the candidate is tiny, but the voice of all the outside groups is large. Now, there's a lot of criticism about Citizens United. But you have to realize that what Citizens United ultimately, the intent was to provide parity for big corporate media. For example, General Electric owns NBC. Their voice was as big as they chose to make it. Okay, but my roofing company had no voice whatsoever, because I didn't own a media company. And we have to realize that media is big corporate America as well. And so what Citizens United ultimately made the determination was, well, hold it here. If big corporate America media gets to have unlimited political speech, then why can't Kimberly-Clark Corporation or Gulfstream or whomever? But there's a problem that ended up transpiring with all that, is that members of Congress, they're restricted in what really they can raise and what people can give to them, which is fully disclosed, versus any outside group that doesn't have the same levels of disclosure on it. And so there's probably better ways of getting at campaign finance reform. I'm all ears. Shoot me an email and tell me what we should do.
For me, I think it's one of the biggest threats to our democracy, that redistricting, our voting rights, and the campaign finance. And Citizens United, I think it was after the Florida Republican primary, all the money that had been spent in all the states up to that point, I think it was 180 people had donated like 80% of it. So at that point, free speech is really pretty expensive. It's no longer, I think, what it was intended to be. So whether it be Citizens United and watching that outside money come in and really corrupt the process significantly, the cost of elections, what it costs to run for Congress, it used to be the number one guarantee of getting elected to Congress was that you were reelected. I think it was like 94%. What topped it a couple years back was whoever raises the most money is most likely to get elected. So then that's called an auction in business, but it's still called campaign finance in how we do our elections. So that's a real big problem. And then finally, not that this is in and of itself a problem, but I think the faces of Congress are changing a little bit. And it was just said that a majority of members of Congress are now millionaires. And that's not necessarily representative of society. And because often people are self-finance candidates. So I'm starting to notice in both parties, people running for office who just write a check. They don't even have to worry about fundraising because they're just purchasing that access and counting on that percentage. So to me, it's one of the great threats to democracy. It touches almost every issue, but it's really hard to get the public interested at the right level. And therefore, you're asking people who've got elected by the old system to change the system. It's a very difficult change.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi. I'm really worried about the election process. And of course, Wisconsin just got rid of Saturday and Sunday early voting and only 2 weeks of early voting. North Carolina did the same thing. I'm really worried about this and the effect of ALEC and the effect of the states that are dominated by one side to keep people from voting.
I think Reed was really articulate when he said, politicians are trying to choose their voters rather than voters choosing your elected officials. And part of the problem is this redistricting changes that are allowing that. I have a problem with the voting changes. I got in within 6 months of getting elected. I introduced a constitutional amendment. Not that that's a little bit ambitious of a try, but I thought, it's an issue I wanted to talk about, which was the right to vote. I see these attacks, not just in Wisconsin, but many states. And we saw the Supreme Court decision last year that made it, in some of the states that have historically been problematic for some voters to be able to vote, that kind of made it so they can make it harder again. I think there's over 80-some laws in 31 states out there right now to make it harder to vote. So, we've introduced a constitutional amendment that says you'd have an explicit right to vote. You don't have that right now in the Constitution. It's implied. There's provided for blocking discrimination against, but there's no explicit right. And if you think about it, when the Constitution was written, 20% of the people voted, white male property owners over 21. So we've come to a place where, now it's a different country. We want people to have that access. And I think anything we do that makes it tougher works against having people select their elected representatives. And I think, again, Reed put it really well. I mean, that's what that vote is. It's you selecting us rather than we selecting you.
Yeah, and I would just say to that, in our lifetimes, and I'm almost 60 years old, we've actually seen broader times to vote than less. It was much more difficult for me to vote when I was 18 than it is today because the windows have been opened wider, voting booths stay open longer, there's more days with which to do early voting. And so I think you're going to see a continual evolution there as the American people speak up about what they like or dislike about current voting laws. And so aware of the concern, you bet.
Other questions? Yeah, Alderman.
Hi, I'm Alderman Nick Kovac in the city of Milwaukee. I'm chair of the Finance Committee, so I really have appreciated the conversation, especially around cooperating on the budget. But I wanted to ask both of you for some advice because we're nonpartisan, so I'm neither Republican nor Democrat, but I'm proud to call myself a progressive. So I understand that there are certain issues like the corrections budget versus the education budget, which should be more sacrosanct, where you're going to have legitimate disagreements. And so you expect those and you try to win those fights, but you respect your opposition. Lately, though, in the state of Wisconsin, and I know that Congressman Pocan has experience, he knows what's going on well, but when you described yourself as a libertarian, Congressman Ribble, that made me wonder, there are certain sort of sacrosanct libertarian Republican positions about local control that this legislature has been trampling on, whether it comes to the ability to do residency, to negotiate with their own unions, or to the voting is a great example. Why can't the city clerk decide how to do voting hours as long as we do it fairly and within the law? Or, frankly, whether you agree in whether we should invest in roads or transit, the idea that we're going to change utility rules specific to the city of Milwaukee. So the state of Wisconsin is kind of trying to run the city of Milwaukee now, which seems to be a contrary to these long-held 1776 principles. How can we best make that case that, as in a bipartisan or nonpartisan way, government knowing its own limits, especially in Madison?
I'll put it to you this way, having never served in the state legislature and it being a state issue. I agree to a point that government is best that's local. And so the closer government gets to the people, the more control you have over it. Ultimately, if the state assembly and state senate and governor are not doing what the citizens want, the ultimate correction's at the voting booth. And so that's always the voters' choice of last resort. They get to make the change there. But I would continue to make the argument that local control is better than state control, and I make the exact same argument from Washington that state control is better than Washington, D.C. control. And I firmly believe that, and my voting record reflects it. I would much rather leave it up to the citizens of Wisconsin to take care of their neighborhoods, their roads and bridges, and whatever support we can give them, that's fine. But at the end of the day, I would prefer to have the bright people in this room making decisions on behalf of themselves rather than some bureaucrat in Washington making those decisions for them.
Yeah, and I agree with what Reed's saying. It's really about advocating for that. A lot of people say they want local control, but then they don't necessarily vote that way. And how can you try to hold them more accountable to understand that? I'm glad that I served at local government first. I spent 3 terms on a county board. The buck truly does stop there. Federal mandate, unfunded, state mandate, unfunded, county level, you can't pass on anything unfunded. You had to pay for it. So getting a chance to see the connectivity from that local government to the state to the federal, and I see it now, where we still come up with sometimes ideas and we provide no funding and somewhere it's going to be paid for. So I think, just stressing the local control, as Reed said, and trying to find maybe partners who've served in local government who are in the legislature or Congress that you might be able to work from that angle is worthwhile.
And I would add one other thing. Whatever the government subsidizes, the government regulates. So you want more control and more freedom from Madison, ask for less money from Madison. And that gives you more control then over the money that's here. And so if you just kind of remember that core idea that whatever the government subsidizes, the government regulates, will help you get to more liberty.
Let's take 1 or 2 more quick questions. Anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
I have voted since 1956. I served in the military for 32 years. I voted absentee every election. I am so frustrated with the local politics and even national politics that I write in my wife Pam Fauci, her name goes in every time. But I wish that we would have candidates like you two, because you guys are great.
That's kind. By the way, thank you for your service.
That's definitely better than the Ebola virus. I mean, that's
next time I'm going to have them call you and they do that poll.
Wow, that's heady stuff right there. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the major issues we have today is the fraud and identity. And if you haven't recognized it, Target recognizes it, the healthcare industry recognizes it, the voter election recognizes it, the state and local modalities have a need to have a positive identification process. The GAB on Wednesday is hearing about how they're going to address voter ID and through automation, through technology. The federal government has, for its employees and for both of you congressmen, an identity badge that has an electronic chip in it that is a secure process that has been recommended by the technology industry as a standard way of adding security to our Social Security number, which we all know is compromised and is not a very good positive ID. Congress was presented with the idea of nationalizing that, providing a national, was proposed as the Affordable Care Act as a patient ID, but it could be a nationally spread one. Why is that so difficult for the federal government and the Republicans and Democrats to agree on?
Honestly, I haven't thought about the issue as a national ID. I've only been around a little over a year. I can tell you the only thing I'd look at is sometimes it's perspective of where the problem is. I mean, when you've got ID theft and we know what it costs in hours and dollars to unravel that, to me that's a big issue, and we should tackle in a bipartisan, nonpartisan way. When it comes to voting, though, I can tell you, unfortunately, I served a lot of years on the Campaigns and Elections Committee, and voter fraud, it is more likely you'll be struck by lightning than commit voter fraud. Then in that case, I don't know if you put the same attention, it's true, that's the numbers in Wisconsin, if you want to put that kind of time into that same thing. So I think at some point it's having government realize, one, where we can best affect something, but where the real problem is. I think sometimes government's not the best at identifying that real problem. And I think just to what you're saying, the one thing I'd be watching the next step out is in the cyber world. While it's not directly to identity, but if you want to worry about something, I would start worrying about cyber attacks and other things where we think our current situation is around warfare and other issues. That's going to be a very antiquated way things happen down the road, and it makes me think a little bit on the identity stuff because it does hit some of the privacy issues.
Identity theft also implies the hackers and the access to creating the security in the cyber world. So you can control it, not absolutely, but better if you have a secure identity.
Yeah, I think after watching kind of how the NSA has operated in the last couple of years, the idea of a national electronic voter ID system is something that gives many Americans pause. And so the Congress isn't there yet. I mean, we have our own electronic ID. You're absolutely correct. This is what it looks like, and but this is my voting card. I get to put it in. It electronically reads my name and identifies who I am and so forth. But at the end of the day, the American people are very nervous about the government having too much data and too much information on their private lives. And so how we get there and how we do all that yet, I think, is still something that's evolving, and we're still learning and trying to figure out how to maintain privacy and while still having security. They're difficult things to get together.
I'm going to wrap things up there. I'm going to ask all of you just to hang with me for 1 minute here, because we've got a really busy on the issues calendar, and I'd like to just pique your curiosity just a bit. Next week, on the 25th, we'll have the Democratic gubernatorial candidate Mary Burke here. On the 26th, we will have the latest Marquette Law School poll. In April, on the 10th of April, we will have Sheriff David Clark will be with us. And then we have a really busy week on the 21st. So kind of clear out your week and join us Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It's free lunch. I mean, you can't beat that. But on the 21st, we have retired General James Jones, former National Security Advisor for President Obama. He is now talking about the Keystone Pipeline. He is a supporter of it, and he'll be here to talk about energy independence for this country. On Tuesday, Kenneth Gamble. For those of you who are old enough, he was the creator of the Philadelphia Sound. A lot of big hits, which you all would know. But what's interesting is he's been doing an awful lot in terms of being a social entrepreneur. He's opened 2 charter schools in Milwaukee. He has some pretty strongly held opinions about what we're doing in terms of our communities in this country, and he'll be here to share them. And then on Wednesday, Senator Tammy Baldwin will be with us. One other thing, Alan Borsick, our fellow here at the law school, and one of the best people I know to talk about the issue of education, has put together a great conference for the 1st of April. And I hope if you have time, you'll join us that morning. We'll be talking about, as we all know, we have a superintendent to find here in the city of Milwaukee, and we're going to be talking about what's working in urban education in other parts of the country. It should be a great day. So we've got a busy calendar coming up. We hope you can join us for some or all of it. And in the meantime, I'd like to say thanks to all of you for being with us, for your attention, your good questions, but most of all, thanks to our guests, Congressman Mark Pocan and Congressman Ribble.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.